are the most important features that you're going to want to consider if you're in the market for a mini excavator? Hi, welcome to the PFO channel. I'm Jim. I've been very happy with the choice I made on the mini excavator that I bought. I picked this up in an online auction, but I didn't just start bidding on the first one that came up. I started at a point of knowing almost nothing about mini excavators. I did a lot of research ahead of time, and I went and visited some of the auction yards a little bit closer to home during the inspection period and crawled around on a few of them to increase the odds of making a good decision when I finally pulled the trigger on one. Even though they look very similar at a glance, there's really lots of differences from model to model. Even within a particular manufacturer brand name, the features on any given model vary greatly. And if you haven't put a lot of thought into what exactly you want before you go buy something, you run a good chance of being disappointed. So what are the most important features? Based on my experience and the research I did prior to buying the one that I ultimately chose, I boiled down everything I learned, and I've come up with what I'm going to say are the top 9 things that you need to consider if you're about to go into the market shopping for a mini excavator. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are a lot of other important things to consider, and I'd love to hear your comments. We can all learn from more viewpoints on the subject. And by the way, these are not necessarily in order of importance except for the last one. I'm going to save what I think is the most important consideration for last today. The rest of them are in no particular order. All right, so here's the list. Number 1 is the size of the machine and the weight class. Now, the size of the machine that you need to get for your purposes is going to depend entirely on what work you plan to do with your mini excavator. If you're going to be doing lighter jobs, like maybe digging a trench to run water and electric into your new workshop, or moving some rocks around the yard for some landscaping, that sort of thing, then you could probably get by with a 1-ton machine. If you're going to be digging footings for a new construction, you're going to want something bigger than that. And if you're going to be digging basements, well, really a basement excavation job is not a job for a mini excavator. You're probably going to be looking at a standard size machine for that. Now, we talked about size here. What about the weight? What does the weight have to do with it? This is a 1-ton machine, and by the way, that terminology is completely new to me. Usually when I talk about 1 ton, I'm talking about a pickup truck. On mini excavators, that's got nothing to do with the amount of weight you can move with it. That's talking about the weight of the machine itself. And the reason that's important is basically Newton's 3rd law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you put a 1-ton downward force out here on the boom when you're trying to rip loose a bucket full of dirt, you're putting a 1-ton upward force back here on the machine. So you have to have balance between the weight of the machine and the rip-out force or the lifting force of your boom. If your machine isn't heavy enough, you run the risk of being down in the hole looking out. We'll talk later about some of the features that can counteract that, but I'm going to put all that in a different category. Another consideration related to size is what is the area into which you need to take this machine to be able to do the jobs. For example, if you're going to add a bathroom in your basement, one of the reasons these mini excavators exist is because you'd have to take the canopy off, but width-wise, they'll fit through a 36-inch wide door frame. If you could drive this right into the basement, use a hydraulic demolition hammer on the boom to bust up your concrete, and then use a bucket to scoop it out and excavate for your basement bathroom with one of these things. One of the things I plan on doing with this machine is helping me cut firewood. I can still put an 8-foot elm log, one on each shoulder, and carry it out of the woods over to my trailer. You may have seen that in one of my other videos. It's not the smartest thing I've ever done. And the older I get, the less fun that seems to be. This machine here, I can take it out in the woods with me, and with the mechanical thumb on there, I can pick up those logs and move them to wherever I need them to make them easier. In fact, I can pick them up and hold them at waist height to buck them into firewood. So this is going to be pretty handy for me during firewood cutting season. And with this small of a unit, I won't have to widen out those trails much at all, if any. And I'll be happy to add that extra muscle to my team. Another consideration with regards to the size and weight is transportation of the unit. If you're going to take delivery of your mini excavator on your homestead or at your place of residence, and it's going to stay there until you sell it and the next owner comes and gets it, well, then this particular point isn't necessarily going to affect you. But if you plan on either hiring it out or loaning it out, hey, your brother-in-law calls up and says, hey, I need a trench. why don't you bring that toy over here and let's dig a hole? I mean, if you've got a piece of machinery like this, it would really be nice to be able to accommodate friends and family and helping complete some of their tasks. That would make owning of this seem a little bit more worthwhile, wouldn't it? Now, for me, I have a half-ton pickup truck, and I've got a single-axle landscape trailer, and with that rig, I had just enough towing capacity and payload capacity to be able to travel to the auction yard, load this thing up, and safely make it home. I was on the safe side of the max, but I didn't have a whole lot of wiggle room. So if you're going to get a mini excavator and you plan on moving it around, you're either going to need to choose the size of the mini excavator to fit the trailer and truck you already own, or you're going to have to buy a truck and a trailer that will accommodate the mini excavator that you end up with. And if you're not careful, you're going to end up with a really big truck and trailer.
As if that's a bad thing.
So to wrap up item number 1, size and weight, you want to make sure that the mini excavator you choose is big enough to do the work and small enough to get it to the work. All right, well, what's next? Item number 2, control options. When you start shopping for a mini excavator, you'll see at least 3 different types on the controls. This is one of the types. The machine I've got has joysticks to control the bucket and the boom, and it has levers to control the forward and reverse on the tracks. The short middle lever controls the blade up and down, and the one off to the side here controls the auxiliary hydraulics out here on the boom. On some of the units, instead of having levers to control the tracking, you're going to have a pair of pedals. Some units are going to have another pedal, maybe one on each side to control your auxiliary hydraulics. And then there's another type that's called pilot control. And what that does is it takes these joysticks and it puts them back here on either side of the seat. So instead of leaning forward, you can just sit back, relax, and run your joysticks. And those, I'm going to say invariably, are paired with pedals for your track control. If I'm wrong about that or anything else, leave a comment below. As is the case with a lot of these other things that we have talked about or are yet to talk about today, when it comes to the controls, there isn't really a right or wrong or a good, better, and best on how these controls ought to be situated. It's more a matter of preference. Pretty much all backhoes and excavators follow one of 2 control patterns or standards. There's an ISO standard and an SAE standard. And it's pretty much just talking about the joysticks themselves, whether they're up front here or back here as pilot controls. The joysticks are what we're talking about here. The other things, the track controls, the blade controls, the auxiliary controls, those aren't covered by these standards. We're just talking about the joystick controls. These are 4-way valves. You can go front, back, left, and right on either one of these. The other levers are 2-way levers. You can just go front or back on them. So what we're talking about for control patterns is what exactly moves when you move your joysticks. Okay, so you don't get lost. This is the dipper, also known as the stick. This is the one that retracts or extends. This is the boom. That's the one that raises or lowers or goes up and down. This is the bucket. You curl the bucket or you dump the bucket. That's pretty easy. The easiest to remember is the swing left and swing right, because that's this whole thing swinging. Under the ISO standard, the left joystick controls the dipper and the swing. Front and back controls the dipper, either extending it or retracting it. And then the left or right swings the entire boom. It actually swings more than the boom. It swings the whole cabin and boom, everything attached to it. The only thing that doesn't swing is the track. The right joystick controls the boom, which is this part here, either raises it or lowers it. And the right and left either curls or dumps the bucket. And as you can see in the demonstration that's running while I'm talking here, this particular unit is in fact set up with ISO joystick control pattern. Under SAE, the left controls the boom and the swing, while the right controls the dipper and the bucket. So if that's not confusing enough already, they're not exactly backwards. Because on both ISO and SAE, tipping the left joystick right or left causes it to swing, and tipping the right joystick right or left either curls or dumps your bucket. So the only part of that that's backwards between the two is what happens when you move the left forward or back or the right forward or back. So ISO, it's left is dipper, right is boom, and on SAE, left is boom and right is dipper. There's a tricky little way for me to remember which is which, because on the right, it's B and B, it's boom and bucket. But I got boom and bucket on the right, dip and swing on the left. Boom and bucket, dip and swing. Boom and bucket, dip and swing. What works for me might not work for you, particularly if you choose a unit that has SAE controls. You're going to be boom and bucket, dip and swing, but that's going to be backwards, but not completely backwards, right? Only partially backwards. So which one should you pick? Well, if your day job is sitting in the hot seat on a backhoe or an excavator that's set up for SAE controls, and you can pretty much do that in your sleep, I hope you don't, but you're just buying a mini excavator to use around your house on evenings and weekends, then probably the last thing you want is a mini excavator at home that's set up with ISO controls after running one all day at work that's set up on SAE controls. So if you're used to one or the other, then that's probably what you want to go for when you shop. For me, I have the advantage, I'm not sure it's an advantage, maybe it's a disadvantage, but for me, I've only got a few hours spread over 30 years on a backhoe with SAE control patterns. And until I bought this, I had exactly 0 hours on a backhoe or excavator or anything else with ISO controls. So I don't have any habits formed or any muscle memory that I have to unlearn. But if you do, then you need to shop accordingly. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, I will say this again with regard to the control patterns. If you can't find a machine that's set up the way you want it already, you can at least look for one that can be easily switched into what you want. As it turns out with this particular unit, you can take off these bolts off of this front cover, and that exposes the valve bank in there, and you can figure out which ones are which, mark them so you don't get lost, and then swap them out so that you could convert this from ISO control pattern to SAE control pattern. On some units, that might not be as easy to swap those out. Now from category 2, control style, we can flow very easily into category 3, which is operator comfort. Now for me, I've got very long arms, so it doesn't bother me a bit to set in this and reach out here and do all the controls out front. Honestly, I don't think I'm going to be putting in long, grueling days to where I'm going to be fatigued from reaching out to control these. The seats. This particular one has a seat that'll slide forward and backward. Some of them don't. If that's important to you, you need to check that out before you buy one. So besides just the position you're sitting in when you're running it, getting on and off is also sort of a matter of comfort. One thing that I really liked about this, and I did notice before I bought it, was that this has the 2 vertical members holding up the sun canopy. The first one of these I ever climbed onto in my life, it had 4 canopy supports. It was not as comfortable getting on and off. And I'm going to say visibility is also in the comfort category. When I'm operating this thing, my head is always on a swivel to make sure that nobody has walked up, make sure that I'm not tail swinging into a tree or something. And it would be pretty uncomfortable on this thing if there was a lot of blind spots that I had to twist my neck around and twist my back around every time I wanted to check a blind spot. Another big factor on comfort is, I'm going to say, air circulation. On this, you've got a lot of air circulation. I've also seen some of these units with a fully enclosed glass cab. I'm sure they're wonderful in the wintertime, but in the summertime, it's going to be really hot, really fast. And if it rains, unless it's got some awesome fan on the defroster, it's going to fog up in a heartbeat when it starts raining. I've also seen some of these units with a fully enclosed glass cab that have a little mini split cooling device hung on the outside of it. And speaking of blind spots, that particular configuration has an enormous blind spot on the side where the mini split is hung. So I'm going to say with or without a glassed-in cab is certainly something you want to consider under the comfort category. All right, category number 4, and this is a fun one, availability of attachments. Just like the size and the weight ought to be something that you work out for yourself very early on in your research before buying one, because it is completely related to what you plan to do with it, so is the concern about availability of attachments. But for the most part, you're going to get a trenching bucket of one width or another. This also came with a mechanical thumb. For what I'm going to use this for, that combination is probably going to cover 90% of what I'm going to do with it. But there are some other things that I want to do that will require different attachments. One of the first things I bought was a tilt bucket for this. The smooth front edge on that will allow me to smooth out some dirt. Like when I backfilled the trench out here, I used the blade on the front to smooth it, but I think I would have liked to have the smooth tilt bucket to do a little bit better job of finish grading that. Also, one of the things that I noticed, the bucket and the boom can only function in whatever plane the unit happens to be sitting on. So if you're on a slope, the bucket's on a slope. Okay, well, if you have a tilt bucket, you can be working on a different plane than what you're sitting on. There's a lot of attachments available for these things. You got the hydraulic thumbs, you got augers, different size bits on them. You got demolition hammers for like breaking concrete. There's grapples, trenching buckets in all different widths. You got smooth buckets in all different widths. You got quick connect fittings. You got ripper teeth. You got rakes. You got sand buckets, and even ditch bank mowers. After you build the list of what kind of work you want to do and what kind of attachments you need to do that work, you got to confirm that not only those attachments are available for that size class of machine, but also that your machine is powerful enough to run them. Probably the best example of where there might be a mismatch is I know I could get a ditch bank mower that would fit on my 1-inch pins, but I think I'd have two problems with that with this machine. One would be I don't know that the hydraulics can push enough fluid to spool up that mower. The other limitation I think I'd have is those ditch bank mowers are pretty heavy, and I think a 1-ton unit is probably going to be a little bit lightweight for effectively counterbalancing the weight of that ditch bank mower extended out into the ditch. Now again, I'm not an expert, but I'd say if a ditch bank mower is on your to-do list, then you probably want at least a 2.5-ton machine. But part of doing your research before buying is checking with actual experts and reading up on what the manufacturers recommend. I would look at not only the recommendations of the manufacturer of the mini excavator, but also take a hard look at the recommendations of the manufacturer of the attachment. Category number 5 is engine, or let's say engine / power source. And by power source, I mean that which drives your hydraulic systems. No matter what size and weight class you get, there's going to be 3 options. Most of the units you see are going to either be a gasoline engine or they're going to be a diesel. But there are companies now offering a full battery electric mini excavator. I've never seen one up close, but it sounds like a pretty intriguing idea. I like the idea of it being quiet. Now, just like we talked about earlier, when we talked about controls, we said that that's pretty much a matter of personal preference. In my opinion, the choice of engines is also pretty much personal preference. For me, I have exactly 0 experience with owning, operating, or working on diesels. On the other hand, I'm extremely familiar with these lawn and garden class gasoline engines. So for me, it's an easy decision. I want a unit with a gasoline engine. Now, me personally, I'm not at all intimidated by the knockoff engines. I've visited enough factories in China, good ones and bad ones, that I'm pretty comfortable. I know what things they copy well, and I know what things they don't copy well. For you, if you're a diesel mechanic, if you've owned a lot of diesel equipment, you're probably going to want to shop for one of these with a diesel. Personal preference thing, but just know that those options are out there and give it some consideration before you buy one. Number 6, hydraulic system. As we've pointed out earlier when we were talking about attachments, a robust hydraulic system with the proper attachments can really add to the versatility of your equipment. So here's some things to think about. I have noticed as I'm crawling around on mini excavators at the auction yards lately, maybe I'm just noticing it more, but it seems to be more of them popping up with dual hydraulic pumps on them. And most of the lowest end ones that you're going to get for under $5,000 at an auction price are going to have a single hydraulic pump. And contrary to some of the myths that are circulating out there, you're not going to get faster tracking with 2 pumps. These things are notorious for tracking extremely slowly. The main reason that you would want 2 pumps or 3 pumps on a mini excavator would be if you're running some sort of an operation or some sort of an attachment that requires high pressure and or flow for extended periods of time. An example of that would be if you're running a flail mower, that takes pretty high pressure and flow all by itself. But if you're running a flail mower while you're tracking along a ditch bank, for example, and adjusting the boom to reach it down and come up and down over obstacles, you're running your tracks, you're running your boom, and you're running your auxiliary, which is high flow. That's when you're going to want 2 or 3 pumps. One hydraulic feature or accessory that I have yet to see personally offered on a mini excavator as original equipment. Now, maybe that's because I haven't spent any time at all shopping the higher end units, but that would be a hydraulic cushion valve. And the most common circuit to have a cushion valve on is the spin motor. And the reason is the spin motor takes quite a beating when you're turning this machine, particularly if you're swinging it with a heavy load out on the end of the boom. There's a tremendous amount of momentum, and stopping that can be really hard on your spin motor and the gears on your spin motor. And the cushion valve actually gives a bypass route for some of that pressure spike to bleed off and go around the valve, so it kind of brings it to a slow stop. It's pretty uncommon on the mini excavators as an OEM item, but it's readily available. You could add one if you want, if that's something you're concerned about. Another hydraulic system component that's highly prized is an inline filter that's easy to change. It's one of the most common DIY add-on features to the hydraulic system on these mini excavators. And there's not going to be any special considerations you have to look for on the machine in order to ensure that you will be able to add it later. The last thing I'm going to talk about under hydraulics is the cooling. One issue that these things are notorious for is running really hot. Probably somewhere right there neck and neck in terms of the most commonly done DIY upgrade to these, right there with adding an inline hydraulic filter. That is adding an inline hydraulic cooling system. A lot of them don't have it as OEM equipment. The minute I decided to buy this make and model was when I popped the hood. Now I was 90% there just when I popped the hood, just because of the fact that it had a hood to pop. But as soon as I popped the hood, I saw a hydraulic radiator with about a 7 or 8 inch electric fan on the side of it, and that pretty much sealed the deal. I was, from that moment on, shopping only for an LH12R, whatever LH and R stand for, and I don't even know what the 12 stands for. And oh, by the way, I'm not putting this machine forward as the ideal example of the best of all these categories we're talking about. No, the reason I'm standing behind this and pointing to it and using it as a visual aid is when I look around the shop for a mini excavator that's conveniently at hand to be used as a visual aid when talking about mini excavators, this is the only one I see. So there you got it. One subcategory of hydraulics that you will notice a pretty big difference as you look at one unit versus another is how exactly they have accommodated auxiliary hydraulics out on the boom. This unit has a separate valve off to the left here to control the auxiliary hydraulics. And you can see it has this block out here with a capped off hose. This one doesn't have any sort of valve. It's just a block to secure this so it doesn't rattle around. You'll see a lot of variations on this. I've seen some where this is just hanging loose and flopping in the breeze. I've seen at least one unit that if it was there, I couldn't find it. So don't necessarily assume that every mini excavator out there is even going to have auxiliary hydraulics plumbed already on the boom for you. That may not be the case. Some units I've seen really go the extra mile, and they have a 3-way valve out here. And what that would do for you is, for example, if you had a hydraulic thumb and you wanted to take the bucket off and put an auger on, you could hook up the lines for your auger, throw the switch, and run the auger, and you would not have to disconnect the hoses to your hydraulic thumb. You could just leave it tucked up out of the way and not have to disconnect that and then reconnect it when you're done with your post holes. So just as we mentioned on some of these other categories, when it comes to hydraulics, the best way to proceed is going to be to do the research to see what's available, evaluate your needs to see which of those available things you want to include in your machine, and then determine which of those need to be on your must-have list versus which of those you can add it later. For item number 7, let's talk about ease of maintenance. If your ownership model is to buy it from a factory authorized servicing dealer and take it back to them for all of its maintenance and any repairs that are needed, then this isn't such a big deal for you. But for do-it-yourselfers like myself, this is a huge deal. But if you are the kind of person that's going to plan on taking everything back to a servicing dealer, you can't skip this category. Particularly if you're considering buying one of the low-cost Chinese manufactured mini excavators like this one here. If you hope to buy it from a servicing dealer and take it back there to have all your service and repairs done, then you need to take a hard look at which brands have a servicing dealer in your area. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but when it comes to some of these lower cost Chinese brands, it's not a matter of finding a servicing dealer in your area. It's more of an issue of whether or not there's a servicing dealer in your country. Don't assume that they're going to be there to help maintain it and repair it when the time comes. So what about the do-it-yourselfers like me? I'm basically thinking about how hard is this thing going to be to do the maintenance and to do the minor repairs. Heavy repairs, that's a different issue, and I'm not going to deal with it here. But while I was doing my research, I noticed at some point that a lot of these units, you can't even get to the engine. You could lift up the seat and look down in there and see the engine. But if you wanted to like change the oil, you had to start taking bolts off of these heavy metal panels around the edge and then lower this heavy panel off to be able to just change the oil or even reach the pull starter. These are electric start, but if your battery goes dead, it does have a recoil starter. But if you can't reach the recoil starter without taking panels off, then that's just not a good situation. Some of the units that I personally inspected had no less than 16 bolts that had to come out in order to get clear access to the engine. You look on the back here and there aren't even any exposed bolts to start taking off on here. When you look closer, you see down inside here, kind of hard to see them in there. Yeah, they're right up. There's 3 on this side and there's 3 more over on the left. And to get to those, you have to first remove the 6 bolts that are holding this oval screen on the middle here. Then you have to reach in to the right or to the left and take out those other 3 bolts. And then you have to lift this out of here. And you can see that it's overlapped by this heavy cast iron counterweight. And it actually comes up from the bottom and overlaps that compartment a little bit. So you couldn't just add hinges after the fact on this. Now, if this isn't bad enough, look at the one that is otherwise the same as this, but they've added the glass cab. On that one, you've got the counterweight coming up over the bottom, but then you've got the lip of the cab reaching down over the top. So that thing is locked in from both ways. Even after you get those 6 bolts off the middle and then the other 6 bolts off of this, it's still locked in there because you'd have to lower it down to clear the top flange of this cab, and you'd have to raise it up to clear this counterweight. And you can't do both at the same time. So on this one, you'd have to go around inside the cab here, and you can see there's 4 bolts. There's 2 behind the seat to the sides, and then there's another one down on the floor, and then one across from it over there. And you'd have to at least take those out and then tip the cab forward while you were removing that rear engine panel. That, in my mind, is about as far from ease of maintenance as you could get on one of these things. I don't know how you could make it harder without just welding all the covers in place and saying, good luck reaching down through under the seat. I was actually sitting on one of those units where you had to remove body panels to change the oil when I looked over and saw one just like this, and I remember thinking, that looks like it has a hood that opens. So I like the hood popping up on this one. I've also seen some where the hood has clamps on the side and it's hinged, so it has a side opening. That gave really good, easy access to the engine compartment. Some of the features you'll see on these are not necessarily going to make it easier to maintain, but it sure ought to increase the interval between repairs. One of those features that comes to mind is the shielding on the hydraulic hoses. A lot of these units that I've looked at don't have any shielding on the hydraulic hoses anywhere. Some of the units out there already have shielding. For example, this one. Availability of parts and technical information is another thing I would consider critical with regard to the ease of maintenance. If you're going to maintain and repair this equipment, you got to be able to get your hands on the stuff to be able to do it if something breaks. Unless you own a machine shop and you can make yourself a new one, a technical resource is pretty important as well. And by that, I mean, if you, let's say the hydraulic pump goes bad, how do I find a replacement? Well, if you have some place where you can go to get some technical help and say, hey, who can tell me what hydraulic pump goes on an AGT LH12R mini excavator? That's a pretty important resource. Now, since I bought this, I have discovered that there are several Facebook groups dedicated to mini excavators, some specifically dedicated to Chinese mini excavators, at least one very specifically dedicated to AGT mini excavators. I joined several of those groups and I've been watching them, and I see that those are going to be a huge technical resource to have at hand. One thing that does not get a demerit under the category of ease of maintenance, or how easy is it going to be to work on, is the need for tools that I don't have. I have a pretty well-appointed workshop here, but I actually like it when I get a piece of equipment that forces me to, gives me the opportunity to go buy another tool. Number 8 in the list of things to consider before buying is price and warranty. I would say for me personally, the issue of price was not just a major consideration for me making my choice of which unit to buy. I would say it was the single factor that started the ball rolling for me even thinking that owning one of these was practical for me. And what I mean by that is, I've known about mini excavators for years, and I've always looked at them and thought, wow, that would be a really handy tool to have around the place. When I thought these were $15,000 to $50,000 a piece, it just never would have happened. And it's not even so much being able to afford one. I would have never concluded that the usefulness of it was worth the cost. Yeah, they're useful, but they're not that useful. You know what I mean? It would never have gotten to the point where it was a high enough priority to make it on my shopping list. What else do you need to consider besides the selling price? Well, clearly you need to know that there's a difference between an advertised price and an out-the-door price. You're probably going to be subject to sales tax, even if it is a private party sale. And that's the only thing I'm going to say about sales tax, is that you know what the rules are for sales tax in your area, and you just need to consider those. In addition to the selling price, though, you might have a delivery fee. You might have, and that might be a freight charge, or at least the cost to go get it. That was the case with me. I planned on going to get it myself. So I was bidding on some units that were an hour from home, some that were 7 hours from home, some that were 13 hours from home. So I had to figure in the cost of going to get it. If you don't plan on going to get it, you need to figure in the cost of the freight. When I decided I wanted to buy one of these, there were really very few of them available for sale anywhere near my home. So I was looking at going at least to a neighboring state, if not across 2 or 3 states, to get one. And it was at that point that I realized that the auctions were a viable option. With auctions, there can be a lot of significant costs involved. Not only sales tax, there I said it again, I said I wasn't going to talk about tax anymore, but most auctions, certainly the one I dealt with, have what they call a buyer's premium. And that can be substantial. I think I paid a 15% buyer's premium over and above my max bid. So when you decide how much you can spend on one of these things, you need to include in your budget all of the costs, and you need to do enough research to understand that whatever avenue you choose to buy it through, that you understand all of the associated costs that go along with buying it through that particular avenue. So I said number 8 was price and warranty. The reason I included warranty under price is that the warranty, or the absence of warranty, plays a significant role in total cost of ownership. The thing you need to consider here is there a warranty offered? And if so, is it worth a dime? Any warranty is only as strong as the company that's backing that warranty. If you're only going to be comfortable buying an expensive piece of equipment, so long as you have a good warranty on it, then you need to limit your shopping to name brand equipment. You need to deal with companies that have been in the marketplace for a long time and have a good reputation and a strong financial standing. Now, don't get me wrong, buying from a company with a weak warranty or with no warranty at all is not necessarily a bad thing. Neither is buying in an as-is format, such as in an auction. These may be perfectly workable scenarios for you, and in a lot of cases, that's the best way to get the absolute rock bottom price. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that if figuring stuff out and doing your own work and hunting down parts, if that's how you roll, then it would probably drive you nuts to call up some company and file a warranty claim and stand around twiddling your thumbs waiting for the free parts to show up. So that brings us to the 9th and final category. But you know what, before we jump into that, if you've stuck it out this far, why don't you go ahead and subscribe and hit that like button. And while you're at it, go ahead and comment and share. Those really are the best ways you can support this channel. All right, let's get on to number 9. Item number 9 is the most important category, and that is safety features. And I'm not just trying to be cliche by saying safety is the most important thing. Safety first. No, for me, this is more personal than that. Maybe you've seen the other video where I brought this thing home from the auction yard, and I just about tipped it over backwards, getting it down off of the trailer. I looked pretty calm in that video. That was actually a pretty scary moment. I don't ever want to do that again, and I'd hate to think that any of you are going to experience that. I guess the good news is I lived and I had the camera going, so you all get to watch the result of my stupidity. So it's from my heart when I say safety is the most important thing. The safety features we're talking about are things like a rollover protection system or a falling object protection system. Now, a rollover protection system doesn't just mean that it's got some posts holding up a plastic canopy up top. This particular one has quite a substantial steel channel on both sides, and it's got some cross braces to tie them together. I don't see any certification stickers on this thing. I don't know what rules and regulations there are governing what you can or cannot call a rollover protection structure, but some of the units I've seen have much smaller steel tubes holding up the plastic cover, and those would almost certainly be dislodged and just become one more piece of debris that's going to hit you in the side of the head just before the ground hits you in the side of the head. Other safety considerations are things like seat belts, arm restraint harnesses, emergency stop buttons, none of which are on this particular machine, by the way. Those are all examples of the different safety equipment that you may or may not find on a particular unit. Now, I mentioned inherent safety. What I'm talking about there are things like stability and balance. Things that affect that are low center of gravity, or a wider track, or a heavy counterweight. Unfortunately, some of the features that make a mini excavator desirable move it in the exact opposite direction of stability and balance. Things like narrow track width to fit through a utility door, things like zero tail swing so that you don't smack it into the wall when you're working in tight quarters. That's going to make it really hard to have a significant amount of counterweight on the back there. But if you're aware of these things and you know what you're looking for, you can maximize the stability and the balance to the extent possible in the size and weight class of the machine that you decide that you need to get your jobs done. There is a bit of overlap between some of the items we talked about earlier and the category of safety. One example is the control setup. I talked about the fact that this particular machine has hand controls only. There's no foot pedals. And I didn't know why that was a problem, or even that that was a problem, until I started getting comments on my video where I just about tipped it over, backing it off of my trailer. Several viewers who are seasoned operators pointed out to me that the way you need to do that coming off the trailer is to reach that bucket out onto the ground and then slowly track forward as you're raising the bucket up so that the bucket never loses contact with the ground the whole way down the ramp. I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. So I came out here and I think, I'm going to practice that. Well, I immediately realized that without foot pedals, I can't operate the tracks and the boom at the same time. So the best compromise I can come up with would be putting the bucket out, touching the ground, and having it curl so it's the smooth side of the bucket, not the teeth, and then letting go of the bucket controls and going down to the track controls, and then track forward a little bit and hope that the bucket slides across the ground, and then raise the boom and just go back and forth between raising the boom and moving the tracks, trying to keep the boom as close to the ground as possible, but I wouldn't be able to keep it in full contact the whole time. It's better than nothing. It's better than tipping over, but it's not the most ideal situation. had I realized that before choosing this machine, I might have taken a little closer look at the ones with the pilot controls and the foot pedals. It's just something to think about. But you're in a wonderful position right now, having watched this video, that now you know about it, where I didn't. So you can consider it. There are some options, expensive as they may be, that can contribute to the stability and the balance. I've seen some units that have expandable track width. This has a pretty decent cast iron counterweight. Some units have a very massive one. Now, you're only going to get so much counterweight on a 1-ton unit. So we've talked about safety options and features. We've talked about inherent design characteristics that lend to or detract from the safety. So I would say that the third leg of that safety tripod is the skill and experience of the operator. I'm probably the worst example of that. Go ahead and watch that video of me backing this thing off the trailer. There's a pair of videos on there. That was my lack of operator experience and skill that put me in that dangerous position. Before I bought this thing, I did all kinds of research on the differences between the machines and the controls and all the other things we've talked about. And I did almost no research on how to operate one of these things safely. You've heard the saying, he knows just enough to be dangerous. Well, that was me in a big way. There are a lot of resources out there, lots of videos, in fact, that give you pointers on the safe operation of an excavator. Now that I had that close call, I certainly have gone out and found some of those videos, and I will continue to seek them out and watch them, and I hope that you would do the same thing. So I'm going to say it again, I'm not an expert, but hopefully there's enough information in this video to make you aware of the important things that you need to consider before you choose which mini excavator is right for you. And now that you know this stuff, please don't skip the homework. So I hope you feel this was worth your time. Again, if it was, go ahead and hit the like button.